Mr. Collector.
Ah, yes, majestic forests, right? I mean, forests aren't all exactly the same. You know, they can have different look, different feels, but what they all got in common, ooh, look at this lush green forest, are trees, man. Forests are collections of trees. Trees are the primary species in the ecosystem of a forest. Now, what's interesting, I don't know if you know this, because we kind of live in a place where it's forest, right? I mean, that's where we live. But you look at the United States, right? Here we are. You can see where, let's see, it's purple. What does it say? Protected forest. So yeah, like the Adirondacks are protected forests. But you can see most of the northeast of the United States is forest. Most of like the south is forested, stretching to the Mississippi and the southern part here, and then the very northern part of the Midwest. And then you don't find forests again until you get to the West Coast, and really just the Northwest and scattered. Most of the United States is not forest. That doesn't mean it's empty. I mean, out here you got some desert here, but most of this part of the United States is what we would call grassland, or like the prairie, where there's actually not enough water or moisture to grow so many trees. Today in class, we're going to tune in on one place called Treetops Valley, which is a forest, and it's located right about here in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. For those of you who know geography, this is the state of Washington. This is the state of Oregon. This is California, just the northern part of California. Here's Nevada, here's Idaho. And you can see that there's a lot of forest along the coast. This black part here would be the Pacific Ocean, and above would be Canada, British Columbia. All right, so Treetops Valley, Treetops Valley. And today when you read about Treetops Valley, I want you to keep a few things in mind. You'll be reading about what we call succession, and it takes place in the Pacific Northwest. And there are lots of different types of plants in this part of the world, from very small mosses and lichens and grasses to trees with different kinds of trees. You have some quick growing deciduous trees like aspens, and then you have quick growing coniferous trees like jack pines, and then you have slower growing trees like Douglas firs. And really, it's in this part of the world, it's pretty spectacular, the trees there, because take a look, this is a Douglas fir. I mean, a Douglas fir is a massive, massive tree. Massive tree. It takes a lot of water to grow one Douglas fir. And they're not even the biggest trees. In the same part of the world, you get sequoias and redwoods, which are even bigger. But what we're going to be focusing are called Douglas firs in Treetops Valley. And I want to tell you, I'm going to do a little bit of defining for you so you know what we're talking about. And then you're going to read, I'll read to you the story of Treetops Valley. First of all, the word pioneer, you probably know, right? The first to move in. So you'll see in Treetops Valley, something happens, and then there's going to be a group of plants that are the first to move in. Those are the pioneers. I already mentioned the Douglas firs, right? Those are big trees. Those are what we call coniferous trees. They reproduce with cones. Some trees reproduce with flowers and fruit, like an oak tree, right? The acorn is the fruit. That means it used to be a flower, right? We call those deciduous leaves or deciduous trees. And the word deciduous means they basically replace themselves. Because in most places, not always, but in most places, deciduous trees drop all of their leaves for the winter and then regrow them in the next spring. Douglas firs do not make flowers, they reproduce with cones. So we call them conifers. That's where their seeds are. And what's interesting about them is most conifers are what we call evergreen. They don't, not really true, but they just don't drop all of their leaves at once. You know what I mean? And they still drop their leaves, but not all at once. Now, around here, the climax community, or like what the forest is supposed to be like here, we call a mixed deciduous forest. But if you go a little bit farther north, and if you go to Treetops Valley, you're looking at a forest full of only coniferous trees. All right, and be careful. Coniferous means with cones. Carnivorous, that's a forest you do not want to be in. So let's take a look at Treetops Valley. It's a story of succession. Treetops Valley, a success story. Scene one. Once upon a time, a boy and a girl lived with their parents at the edge of a beautiful green valley in the Pacific Northwest. They were twins, and their names were Sarah and John. The valley was filled with a vast evergreen forest. Its trees towered over the log cabin where Sarah and John lived. Sarah and John loved the forest. Every day they went exploring. They paddled in the forest's cool streams and made trails under the giant coniferous trees. On their 10th birthday, the family hiked up to the top of the hill near the cabin. They had a birthday picnic and marveled over the sheer size of the valley's tall trees. That day, they decided to name their valley. They called it Treetops Valley. Scene 2. Then, in the middle of a hot summer day, everything changed. A lightning strike started a massive fire in the forest. Flames licked through the woods and threatened to burn their cabin. Sarah and John, now 15 years old, grabbed what they could and saddled up their horses. As they left, they couldn't help but cry. All of the magnificent trees were burned. Seedlings were scorched. The charred ground smelled like death. I can't look at it. Our beautiful forest is gone forever. It will never be the same again. The family moved to a settlement a few miles away. Sarah and John made friends and grew up, but they always longed for their Treetops Valley. Scene 3. 5 years after the fire, Sarah and John were now young adults. They decided it would be time to visit Treetops Valley again. Sarah was reluctant, but they saddled up their horses and rode out to the valley. What a surprise! Things had happened since the fire. Winds had blown seeds into the valley. Birds had dropped them from the air. Seeds had sprouted, and there were mosses, weeds, grasses, and ferns growing everywhere. There were no trees, but the valley was green again. Scene 4. The years went by. Sarah and John had left the settlement to begin their adult lives. John had gotten married, had a son, and became a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse. Sarah decided to try to strike it rich and become a prospector. It was 1890. Big hint. It was 1890, and Sarah had heard that people were heading north to the Klondike to find gold. Sarah was willing to take a risk and join the rush. It was a tough journey, but along the way, she stopped at Treetops Valley. She wrote John a letter. On my way north, I passed through Treetops Valley. You'd be amazed at how it looks now. Everything has changed. The whole valley is filled with berry bushes. I had a feast. That letter gave John an idea. He would take his family to see the valley. He thought, when my newborn son is old enough, we'll go berry picking. That would be fun. For his son, Scene 5. For his son's 10th birthday, they saddled up and went to the valley. John's son loved the valley, but there were no berries to pick. Sarah had made a fortune finding gold and had built a huge house in Alaska. John wrote to her about his trip to the valley. There are lots of green leafy trees there now. These leafy trees have shaded the berry bushes and choked them out. These trees are not the same as the one that we knew, but the valley is filling up with trees again. Scene 6. More time passes. Sarah had traveled around the world, but always yearned to return to her childhood valley. When she was 75, she became very ill and decided to visit the valley one last time. She wrote to her twin brother about her trip. Dear John, remember how we loved Treetops Valley? Well, I decided to visit it again before I die. I am very ill, but the sight of our valley has lifted my spirits. You would be happy to see the valley now. It's beautiful. Now there are conifers growing again. They're not as big as the ones that were there when we were children, but their needles and cones sparked happy memories. Be sure to visit the valley again before it's too late. It's beautiful. Love, Sarah. John was also very old and ill, and although he received this letter, he never got a chance to read it before he died. Scene 7. Years later, John's granddaughter, Jennifer, found that letter. She read it and knew what she had to do. She had to do what her grandfather was not able to do. She had to visit Treetops Valley. It was 100 years after the fire, and Jennifer took her family to the valley. They drove their station wagon to the edge of the forest. It was filled with giant coniferous trees, just like it was before the fire. Jennifer's family loved the forest. In fact, they decided to return year after year on their annual camping trip. And just like her grandfather and great aunt did, Jennifer's children played and paddled and made trails in Treetops Valley. And they lived happily ever after. The end.